Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on challenges and issues in arbitration practice in India. I'm Vikas Mahendra, a partner at Keystone Partners and co-founder at Center for Online Dispute Resolution. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome an august bunch of speakers lined up for today. They need no introduction, obviously, but for formality, for a quick round of introductions. Honorable Justice B.R. Gavai. Of course, all of you know him. He joined the bar on 16th March 1985 and primarily practiced before the Bombay and Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court. Justice Gavai's primary practice areas were constitutional law and administrative law. He was elevated to the High Court in November 2003 and was elevated as a judge of the Supreme Court on 24th of May 2019. Sir, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you. Honorable Mr. Justice G.S. Patel, again, a person we all know very well. He's a graduate of St. Xavier's College and Government Law College. He started practice in 1987 in Mumbai, working on commercial, corporate, and civil litigations, and also appearing in a large number of environmental public interest litigation. He was appointed as a High Court judge during 2005. He's an avid academic and a prolific writer. Sir, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Next is Mr. Atmaram Nadkarni. Mr. Nadkarni graduated in law in 1986 and went on to complete his master's in Bombay. He worked in Bombay in the chambers of a retired High Court judge before moving back to Goa in 96. Senior advocate Atmaram Nadkarni has been the Advocate General of Goa from 2012 until 2016, when he was appointed as Additional Solicitor General in the Supreme Court of India. Sir, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Moderating this session will be Mr. Divyakant Lahoti. Divyakant Lahoti is an advocate on record and holds a master's degree from King's College London. He handles a wide range of legal disputes and is also an activist lawyer. Divyakant was recently recognized as a shining star of Indian legal fraternity by the Corporate Counsel Association of India. Divyakant, pleasure to have you with us. Finally, but not least, Mr. Shashank Garg, who is a partner at Advani & Co. and is in charge of the Delhi office where he handles commercial litigation and arbitration. He also regularly acts as an arbitrator. He serves as a joint secretary of the Society of Construction Law and is an advisor and chair on a number of arbitration groups. He also regularly writes on a number of arbitration journals and publications. With that brief introduction, if I may hand over the stage now to Shashank and Divyakant to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas, for such erudite introduction of our honorable and distinguished panelist. And without further delay, we request Honorable Justice Gavai to address our participants with his opening remarks. We will take the questions after the addresses of all our speakers are over. Honorable Justice Gavai, over to you, sir.
Thank you. My esteemed colleague, Justice Gautam Patel, Shri Nadkarni, the learned Additional Solicitor General of India, Shri Shashank Garg, Shri Divyakant Lahoti, Shri Vikas Mahendra, and friends. It gives me a great pleasure to be with you this evening to participate in the webinar, Challenges and Issues in the Practice of Arbitration. Coincidentally, it is my first webinar, and I'm quite anxious about it. As all of us know, arbitration is one of the most important tools in the alternative dispute redressal system mechanism. We also know that in the Indian society, ADR has deep roots. We all know about the disputes resolved at the village levels by panchayats. As a matter of fact, they were referred to as Pancha Parmeshwar, given the place of God. In the recent past, due to the huge pendency of more than 3 crore cases at all the levels in the courts in India, the arbitration movement in the country has received a lot of promotion and is gaining a momentum. We know that the arbitration is an alternative to the customary litigation system where the parties can choose an arbitrator of their own choice rather than leaving it to the customary court. The legislature, with an intention to provide speedy and effective justice in the arbitration proceedings, has enacted the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996. We have also seen that in furtherance of the said legislative intent, the Act has gone substantial amendments in the year 2015 and in the year 2019. The legislative intent was to have the minimum judicial interference in the arbitration proceedings. The question that is required to be asked is as to whether the legislative intent of providing speedy and effective justice and ensuring that there is a minimum judicial interference in the arbitration proceedings has been fructified or not. However, if you look at the dockets of the High Court as well as the Supreme Court, and in my personal experience at the High Court and the Supreme Court, I would found that there are various speed breakers in the said movement. The first of the said speed breakers would be the application under Section 11 and the application under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act. Though Section 7 of the Arbitration Act provides sufficient guidelines as to in what matters the arbitration should be appointed and the dispute be referred to arbitration, we find that at various levels, the arbitration proceedings get stuck up in courts. I think that the poor drafting or the ambiguous language used in the documents are one of the important reasons behind this. The Supreme Court, in the case of Booz Allen and Hamilton Incorporation versus the SBI Home Finance Limited, has considered the issue with regard to scope of judicial interference in Section 11 proceedings and Section 8 proceedings. The court found that the scope of interference in the proceedings under Section 11 was much narrower as compared to interference in a proceeding under Section 8. It has been held that in an application under Section 11, once the court finds that there is an arbitration agreement amongst the parties, the court has no other option but to appoint an arbitrator and leave the other issues with regard to arbitrability of the decision to the learned arbitrary tribunal. The only remedy to an aggrieved party would be to file an application under subsection 2, clause B, subclause 1 of Section 34 of the said Act. Whereas in an application under Section 8, the court is required to consider all aspects of arbitrability. Even if the court finds that there is an arbitration agreement between the parties and also finds that the dispute amongst the parties is covered by the arbitration agreement, it is not bound to refer the dispute to the arbitration. If it is found that the relief which is claimed in the suit should not be granted by the arbitrator and it is reserved or can be granted by only public forum, the court can always refuse an interference under Section 8. While doing this, the court has considered the distinction between a lease in rem and a lease in persona. However, you will find that in either of the eventualities, the court is required to consider the question of impleading a non-signatory to an agreement. The Supreme Court, in the case of Sukanya Holdings, had an occasion to consider a question as to whether is any problem. Am I audible?
Yeah, audible,
audible,
but there's
sir.
some, I think, internet problem connection.
Yeah, we can hear you well, sir.
Okay. The Supreme Court, in the case of Sukanya, has held that when a suit involves a lease partly covered by an arbitration agreement and not partly covered by the said agreement, and also covers a lease between the parties, some of whom are party to the arbitration agreement and some of whom are not, then the powers under Section 8 could not be invoked. However, the correctness of the said decision by two learned judges was sought to be raised before the bench of 3 judges in the case of Toro Controls versus Seven Trust Water Purification. However, the court found that it was not necessary to go into that question since the arbitration involved in Sukanya fell under Part 1 of the Act, and whereas the arbitration in the case of Toro Controls fell under Part 2 of the said Act, and therefore, by relying on the words, I quote, any person claiming through or under, and by invoking the doctrines of composite reference, composite performance, and group of companies, held that in exceptional cases, even a party who is non-signatory to an arbitration agreement can be implicated in the arbitration proceedings. However, as we know that after the judgment of Sukanya, certain difficulties were faced, and these were considered by the 246 Law Commission report. Various important suggestions were given in the said report, and on the basis of said reports, various important amendments were carried out to the Arbitration Act in 2015 by the 2015 amendment. Earlier, the Section 8, which was only Section 8 earlier, was replaced by subsection 1 of Section 8 and by adding 2 other subsections. The words which were used in Section 45, any person claiming through or under, were also introduced in subsection 1 of Section 8. The courts also, therefore, finding the legislative intent of getting the entire dispute resolved in the case of Amit Lalchand Shah versus the Rishabh Enterprises, held that the parties which were not signatory to the agreement could also be, in exceptional cases, be implicated as parties to the arbitration. The court found that apart from the doctrine of group of companies, it was necessary to do so, taking into consideration the sense of business efficacy in commercial transactions. The Supreme Court recently, in the case of MTNL versus Canara Bank, has implicated CanFina, which is a subsidiary of the Canara Bank and which was non-signatory to the agreement, by applying the very same doctrine of group of companies. The another aspect which I would like to briefly deal with is with regard to an impartiality of an arbitrator. Like judicial proceedings, the arbitral proceedings are also required to be fair, transparent, just, and equitable. An arbitrator, like a judge, is required to discharge his duties fairly, justly, impartiality, honestly, and with utmost integrity. The 246 Law Commission report also considered the said issue, and taking into consideration the recommendation thereof, various amendments were made to Section 12 of the said Act and the 7th schedule of the said Act. The said amendments provided various disclosures to be made by the arbitrator with regard to any direct or remote interest that he may have in a lease that may fail for consideration before him. As all of us know, the interest could be personal, pecuniary, or an official. Recently, in the 2 cases, one of TRF, taking the legislative intent as could be found in Section 12, read with the 7th schedule, the court found that if an agreement provided that a managing director of a company could be a sole arbitrator, then in view of the provisions contained in Section 12, he was not entitled to continue as an arbitrator, neither he could appoint an arbitrator as his nominee. Subsequently, relying on the said judgment, in the case of Perkins Eastman Architects, this court, the Supreme Court, further held that if the arbitration agreement provided for a sole arbitrator to be appointed by a managing director of the company, such an appointment would not be in tune with the provisions of Section 12 and Schedule 7, and it would hit at the very basis of the impartiality of an arbitrator. These are some of the thoughts which I thought of sharing with you. My colleague Justice Patel as well as Sri Nadkarni are also likely to address you on various other issues. I'm also informed that tomorrow there is another webinar being organized wherein Justice N. Nageshwar Rao would be addressing on the scope of Section 34 along with the other speakers. As all of us know, that recently the Supreme Court has passed an order on 6th of May 2020 extending the period of limitation to all the proceedings under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996. As all of us know also that in view of the lockdowns, the courts are attempting to discharge their duties through virtual courts to whatever extent possible. I have also considered view that this is a golden opportunity for the arbitration proceedings. Since the number of participants in the arbitration proceedings are much less as compared to the judicial proceedings, I think that the lawyers should encourage this opportunity and try to make use of the arbitral proceedings through video conferencing to the largest possible extent. I hope that we will see a day when the legislative intent of speedy and effective arbitration proceedings is fructified at the earliest. Thank you very much for giving me such a patient ear. Thank you. I hand over to Dushyakant.
Thank you, Justice Gavai, for such enlightening and encompassing address on the current issues of arbitration agreement, non-signatory to arbitrations, and unilateral appointment of arbitrators, which is covered under the Perkins judgment. Thank you so much, sir. With this, we now invite our next distinguished speaker, Honorable Justice G.S. Patel. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Divyakant. Good evening, everyone. Justice Gavai, thank you very much for that address. It's a privilege to be here, sharing a platform, a digital platform, with both you and Mr. Atmaram Nadkarni, who we have long held in high esteem for his years of service at the bar. He and I think, share a common love for his home state as well. And I think Justice Gavai shares that equally. That said, there are some issues I think we have been instructed not to address today because of tomorrow's webinar, and that is the Section 34 aspect of it. It is one, I think, that most troubles people. We are not going to be addressing that aspect of it, but there are a few other things that I think we must touch upon. I would like to begin, if I may, in the next few minutes, just explain why I believe not only that arbitration is here to stay, but why it is a vital component of our dispute resolution process. We call it alternative dispute resolution. And this is because it is an alternative to the more formal and formalized dispute resolution process of courts. It is often preferred and said to be preferred simply because it has 2 or 3 unique characteristics. It can, for one thing, deal with very complex technical, and especially in commercial contracts, financially technical issues, which courts may have great difficulty in dealing with. There is an informality about the procedure, since arbitral tribunals and forums are typically not constrained, and now the statute itself says so, by strict rules of evidence and procedure. What exactly this means is something that we will, that I'll mention briefly. Justice Gavai spoke also about the impartiality of arbitrators and why this is a prerequisite. We now find this built into the statute, and this is an important component. I want to focus, if I may, on 2 or 3 salient aspects of this. First is this question of impartiality. Where does it come from? What is the form that it takes? and why it is so often confused with Section 16 and the invocation of the competence principle, i.e. the principle that an arbitrator is qualified to rule on his own jurisdiction. Impartiality and jurisdiction are conceptually two different things, and I think it's best we remove the clutter that surrounds these. I'll also then talk very briefly about what we mean when we say that strict rules of evidence and procedure do not apply, and I have a few suggestions in that regard. I don't think arbitrations are actually new. I think they've always been around for a very, very long time, as long as human beings have had interaction. The formal sense of arbitration may be relatively recent, but people have often gone to friends, relatives, somebody to intercede to decide disputes, whether this took the form of what we now recognize as mediation or we now call arbitration, is really a matter of form. It only means going to a forum other than a court to resolve one's dispute. The selection of an arbitrator is often now a contentious issue, and as Justice Gavai has dealt with that, who can be a party to the arbitration and who should be the arbitrator are now matters that are statutorily controlled. But once you have an arbitrator, there arises immediately the question of his disclosure of his interests. Now, it is crucial to keep an eye at all times on Section 12, read with portions of Section 11, but Section 12 in particular of the Arbitration Act 1996 and the 5th, 6th, and 7th schedules all read together. This impartiality question is again not new or not peculiar to the Arbitration Act. As far as I can tell, and in my understanding of it, it perhaps has its roots in very, very old and well-established administrative law and in judicial decisions. A very interesting decision, in fact, a classic case on the point, is from 1852 of Dynes versus Grand Junction Canal of the House of Lords. Now, it just so happened that there was an appeal, and the Lord Chancellor who was hearing the appeal held shares in one of the companies that was before him, that was the Grand Junction Canal Company. The question was not whether his decision was right on merits. The question was whether he was entitled to hear that matter at all, whether he had an interest. Now, this is interesting, and I want to read to you a few lines from what Lord Campbell said in the House of Lords. Lord Cottenham was the Lord Chancellor at that time. No one can suppose that Lord Cottenham could be, in the remotest degree, influenced by the interest he had in this concern, meaning in this company. But my lords, it is of the last importance that the maxim that no man is to be a judge in his cause should be held sacred. And that is not to be confined to a cause in which he is a party, but applies to a cause in which he has an interest. Now that's important, because that directly speaks to the wording of what we find in the Arbitration Act, even today, 150 odd years later. Since I've had the honor to be Chief Justice of the Court of the Queen's Bench, we have again and again set aside proceedings in inferior tribunals because an individual who had an interest in a cause took a part in the decision. And it will have a most salutary influence on these tribunals when it is known that this High Court of last resort, in a case in which the Lord Chancellor of England had an interest, considered that his decree was on that account a decree not according to law and was set aside. This will be a lesson to all inferior tribunals to take care not only that in their decrees they are not influenced by their personal interest, but to avoid the appearance of laboring under such an influence. Now, this tells us that once we have an arbitrator, it is his duty, and that is Section 12 in terms, very quickly looking at these provisions, he is to disclose, and that disclosure is to be in writing and therefore under his signature, any circumstances. That means all circumstances such as the existence, either direct or indirect, of any past or present relationship with or interest, same words that were used in 1852, in any of the parties or in relation to the subject matter in dispute, whether financial, business, professional, or other kind, which is likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence and impartiality. Now, this is crucial. People go to an arbitrator because they expect him to be impartial and independent and decide without favoring one or the other side. So the appearance, not just the existence, but the appearance of neutrality and of no interest in the cause must be important. In this context, I must at this stage point out something that Justice Gavai, with his typical demeanor, hasn't. He was very recently a member of the bench that decided this case of Alimenta versus NAFED. Now, forget about the merits of that case. One of the peculiar things that happened there was that there was an internal appellate mechanism within the arbitration structure itself. And one of the original arbitrators was said to be defending that award before the appellate forum. Now, I personally find this bizarre. I mean, it is like my going before Justice Gavai and defending why I correctly held in favor of a particular party, in effect appearing for that party. It's inconceivable. It is an inconceivable situation, and there is no end to the trouble, because imagine if there is a dissenting award. Does that mean that the dissenting arbitrator will appear for the respondent and the two majority arbitrators will appear for the other side? It's an inconceivable situation. Procedurally, this is fraught with danger. You can't have systems like this. The interests are set out at exhaustive length, but are not exhaustive in the schedules to the Act. Now, I'm saying, and I'm now explaining this from the base of experience and fairly recent experience. There are many kinds of cases. Of course, if you have a direct interest, there's a direct disqualification. If you're directly related, there's a direct disqualification. But take two extremely peculiar issues which are very frequent. A particular lawyer is regularly referred arbitrations by a large financial company. He has not only one or two, but he has hundreds of them. Is this or is this not a disqualification from him taking the next one? Can he be said to have an interest in ensuring that that company always succeeds in the claims that it brings before him, because that will ensure that the next claim comes his way as well? It's a problem. Sheer volumes are a problem. One has to assess this in the context of the facts and circumstances of each case. I don't think there's a rigid one-size-fits-all formula here, but this is an important consideration. In Mumbai, we have another problem on the original side, especially, and now increasingly, of course, also on the appellate side, where counsel are typically briefed by attorneys. Now, a particular counsel has a briefing from a range of attorneys, as happens in Delhi in the High Court and the Supreme Court. But when that counsel is appointed as an arbitrator, one of the many attorneys who used to brief him happens to have entered appearance for one of the litigating parties in the arbitration. Does this automatically and per se disqualify the arbitrator? I have held in a judgment no on the facts of that particular case. But it could qualitatively perhaps be different if the counsel was found to be, for example, on a retainer from that particular firm. Now, these issues affecting independence and impartiality have to be addressed at the forefront. There is a challenge procedure in Section 13, and in my view, this is a bit of a problem with the statute, because it tells us, and I'm summarizing this, that you must, within a set defined time, 15 days, after coming to know of this disqualification, make that application before the arbitrator, who will decide it. If he holds against you, then your remedy is to proceed to a conclusion of the arbitration and challenge it in a Section 34 proceeding. Conceptually, this creates a problem. if, for example, we take our Dimes Junction versus Grand Junction Canal example, and the judge could never have heard the case, why do we have to go through the cost and expense and the time of going to an award and then a challenge under 34? Courts such as those in Delhi have said, no, if there is such a disqualification that goes to the root, then under section 14, that arbitral mandate of that arbitrator can terminate, or on a reference to the court or an application to the court can be terminated. There are various potential routes that are available, but maintaining arbitral neutrality and independence from start to finish is critical and of the essence. I also want to very briefly mention, I'll be done in a couple of minutes, that this is not to be readily confused with the competence principle embodied in section 16. Because if you read section 16, this does not anywhere speak about disqualifications of an arbitrator as a matter of jurisdiction. Section 16 says that an arbitrator can rule on his own jurisdiction, but that is tied to the terms of the arbitration clause, and the terms of the contract, not necessarily to the disqualifications. I'm not going to deal with interim measures, section 9 and section 17. That has been well covered, and perhaps that is the subject of a full-fledged seminar on its own. But we should look at section 19, and I want to spend a few minutes on this, because this is a situation which often lends arbitrators down the wrong path. It tells us that an arbitral tribunal is not bound by the CPC or by the Evidence Act, and parties are free to agree on the procedure. And the arbitral tribunal, if there is no procedure, may conduct the proceedings in a manner it considers appropriate. But what does this mean? Does this mean that nothing in the Evidence Act applies? Nothing in the Civil Procedure Code applies? That surely cannot be. The Civil Procedure Code, at its heart, requires one thing overall, which is fair treatment of both sides. Now, that is part of the mandate of the Arbitration Act also. You may not strictly follow the Civil Procedure Code when it comes to, let us say, framing issues under Order 14. You may settle points for determination, which may be more flexible. But you can't say there will be no procedure at all. Similarly, when it comes to evidence, there are portions of the Evidence Act, such as the right to perhaps cross-examine a person who has in fact tendered a witness and led his evidence. I have found recently in January and February that there were at least 2 cases where the sole arbitrator, an advocate, in fact followed a very wayward procedure. So there was no question of going into the merits. The entire process by which the conclusion was arrived at was so patently flawed, just as the decision in Alimenta was flawed for that one overriding reason, that it simply could not be sustained. Now, what we do not have in the Arbitration Act is a set of guidelines even, which tells us what should be an optimal or a recommended procedure. There is a lacuna there. Fortunately, our arbitral forums, such as CODR and the Indian Arbitration Forum, have worked and labored long and hard and put together a set of guidelines, which I have had occasion to look at recently with Justice Wazir Dar. And I must say, looking at them closely, I think they're quite remarkable. A, for their flexibility, B, for their accuracy, and C, for their comprehensiveness. Now, it's always possible, even for a non-institutional individual arbitrator, to say, I propose to follow these. What would you like to say on each side? Which of these should we add to or drop or leave aside or say that they're not applicable? But having a defined procedure set out up front takes out one element of uncertainty and one aspect of vulnerability of an arbitral award. Now, if it is going to be a judicial and a statutory policy to minimize judicial interference, then I think one of the things we need to do is to make sure that our arbitral procedures are not themselves terribly ad hoc or individualistic or completely wayward. These guidelines, and they are only guidelines, are very useful from that regard. Now, institutional arbitrations, incidentally, there was a question, why do people not like institutional arbitrations? I suspect that the reason is that they feel they're too court-like. They want something which is a little more informal. Both sides know the arbitrator. They are more comfortable with that situation. I suspect that's what the reason is. But institutional arbitrations have this set of established rules of procedure. And once you sign up for that arbitration being done by that Chamber of Commerce, SIAC or ICC, those rules kick in. And this provides solidity, procedural, structural solidity to the manner in which the proceedings are being conducted. It takes away that element of uncertainty and vulnerability in the resultant award. These, I think, are important factors to bear in mind as we go forward. This is an evolving and a changing field. And I think the sooner we get rid of all these other areas of uncertainty and doubt, we should be able to see a date where arbitration awards go through quickly and are taken quickly to enforcement, which, as the Supreme Court has now said repeatedly, is the ultimate objective of arbitration law. That's what I have to contribute. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting some of the very critical aspects of the practice of arbitration in India, the lesser traveled road of impartiality, and also the procedure that is required in ad hoc arbitrations. There are a lot of questions on that, which we will save for the later part of the webinar. I will now request Mr. Nadkarni, the Learned Additional Solicitor General of India, to give his opening remarks as well.
Thank you, Shashank. Honorable Mr. Justice Gavai, Honorable Mr. Justice Gautam Patel, Shashank, Divyakant, Vikas, and friends. In fact, I fully endorse what has been said by the two preceding honorable speakers, namely Justice Gavai and Justice Patel. A few things to add to it. The difficulties, arbitration is basically a forum chosen for very many reasons. One of it is the courts are overburdened, and therefore we want a quick resolution. And the alternate dispute resolution system, the best one is the arbitration, with some formal things attached to it. The endeavor of the courts have been to have a pro-arbitration approach, tell parties to go for arbitration. And this very arbitration process has found several speed breakers. The first thing which is responsible for this is the faulty drafting. Initially, under the 1940 Act, we did not encourage all this, but 1996 Act precisely came to encourage arbitration. But the faulty drafting in the 1996 is the first cause. The second cause, and added to that, is confusing judgments of various courts. Very many matters. We have seen right from Patel Engineering, etc., Constitution Bench saying so many things. Now, the basic problem is our first honorable speaker, Justice Gavai, referred to the difficulties while appointing arbitrators under Section 8 and Section 11. The appointment of arbitrators, basically, conventionally, it was the party's right to appoint an arbitrator if there is an arbitration agreement. But we have now seen that the Supreme Court has gone, and Justice Gavai referred to it in the Canfina's case. One of the companies of group companies of Canara Bank, Canfina, was asked to be, though it was a non-signatory to the arbitration agreement, was asked to be impleaded in the arbitration. Probably only a Supreme Court can do it under Article 142 of the Constitution. But otherwise, invoking the group of companies doctrine is something, whether or not you can force a party to an arbitration is itself which goes to the root of the matter. If that be so, then the High Courts under Article 226 and the Supreme Court under Article 32 would be free, and even any other court for that matter, to drive the government and all other public bodies to arbitration. So those are things which, I mean, they give rise, because nothing, finality is not attached to that. The second area is, as spoken by Justice Patel, is about independence and impartiality of the tribunal. And he very rightly made a distinction between the competence principle under Section 16, which deals with the jurisdiction aspect and not with the disqualification aspect. Now, I fully endorse what he said, having regard to the English judgment which he has cited, that if there be an objection as to the impartiality of the arbitrator or as regards his independence, then there must be a forum where a party can go and challenge it, so that we don't have to wait. You can save time, money, and energy. Don't have to wait after the award is delivered and raise that under Section 34 in a challenge to the arbitral award. Because that is where you have gone through the whole rigmarole process, and thereafter now you're driving the parties back. Because if the court is of the opinion that, yes, the arbitrator has no business to conduct this arbitration because of his disqualification, then obviously a new arbitrator can be appointed and the whole process can begin. But having gone through the whole process, thereafter in the final award, you make that. And of course, if he's disqualified, then the whole proceedings become a nullity. Now, these are things which have not been taken care by the Act. So I believe the Supreme Court can play some role in this, as it has played in very many cases in other areas also. There are also many other areas of which are gray areas. For example, suppose if there is a minority and a majority award, and the dates of the two awards are different, then for the purpose of limitation, challenging the majority award or the findings and observations in majority and the minority award, which is the last date which is to be taken? The date when the minority award comes or the date where the majority award comes? Because the award then is the majority award. So these are things which have not been dealt with. The third thing is the Perkins judgment, which Justice Gavai referred to. In Perkins judgment, what the Supreme Court has held is that a single arbitrator, which is chosen mostly by these government companies, is something which is illegal and ought not to be. To a great extent, it is correct that it may affect a party autonomy in choosing the arbitrator. But then, if there's a party autonomy, then both parties should have the autonomy to choose the arbitrator. So on that principle, I think in certain justified cases where the government companies who could choose their own arbitrator or foist their own arbitrator on a party, that principle is absolutely correct. The other thing which is required to be, the only thing which is required to be seen is whether the Perkins judgment applies to pending arbitrations, whether it is prospective or retrospective. Now, the Supreme Court has not spoken a word about it. There is no further judgment on it. It's awaited. I think it should be only prospective, because if you apply, then all other arbitrations which are going on, which have been delivered also, will become completely useless. There is one other area which requires major consideration, and that is Section 34. We are not dealing with it, and I also do not wish to go into detail in it. But the thing is, after the recent judgments of the Delhi High Court and Supreme Court, on some forums, it was criticized that how can arbitral award be set aside? Now, we need to understand that arbitral forum or the arbitration process is only an alternative dispute resolution process, namely, maybe because of the expertise which they have, or maybe to save time, money, energy, and it's a quick disposal forum, therefore you've gone there. but that does not mean that all other appellate remedies, etc., have been taken away. There is an appeal, and fortunately, Section 34 prescribes certain grounds on which the appellate court can interfere. It can't interfere like a normal appeal. But that said and done, suppose if the arbitration award is found to be perverse, suppose if the arbitration award, the court is able to see certain things unsustainable, as Justice Patel referred to the other case, and where the arbitration award is completely unsustainable. I mean, no man of ordinary prudence would be able to support that kind of award. There are certain awards of those types. So, I mean, all these cases, Section 34 is a must, and it can't be dispensed with at all. And the criticism that in no case the arbitral award should be set aside, or the court should be loath to interfere with the arbitral award, I do not countenance those kind of criticisms. The judges must be free wherever they feel that something has gone wrong. They must interfere and set aside that particular award. There are other few judgments which have been delivered subsequently, and some other challenges also. One is as regards the disclosure and the confidentiality principle. I believe the confidentiality principle referred to is slightly something to do with the independence, impartiality of the arbitrator. Though these are interrelated concepts, there could be cases where an arbitrator may fail to act impartially by favoring one of the parties or by having preconceived prejudices about the issues in dispute. He may fail to be independent because he's related to some of the parties, or he has financial, professional, or other certain things. Like Justice Patel gave an example where the counsel who used to be briefed by a particular junior was there, and that junior had entered appearance. Strictly speaking, I fully agree with him that in every case it cannot be, it need not be, because it is not that you are going to be, biased. But if there is an issue of bias, then the principle of confidentiality must require the arbitrator to disclose it at the forefront. And we have such a requirement under the Act, but I only feel that the courts must intervene, and wherever they feel, because after all, justice must not only be done, but it must seem to be done. And therefore, these are things, because the importance of disclosure, it's a duty of disclosure, becomes quite clear in the backbone that the foundation of arbitration is basically trust and faith of the parties in the arbitrator. That thing is something which should not get shaken. And in this connection, I must mention that I personally have found now the situation in India is different, but wherever the multinational companies used to be there, they used to always prefer SIAC, ICC, and earlier, of course, DOPS, but now the preference was to SIAC and ICC. Knowing that it would be a little costly also, but doesn't matter, we would like those arbitral forums. Fortunately, now that it's changing, that concept is changing in India. We have these two good forums now which are conducting arbitration process. So the other thing, difficulty which is required to be seen is we need to have and ensure that the arbitral process itself is expeditious and cost-effective disposal. Namely, for example, in certain arbitration matters, those arbitration have been going for last 8 to 10 years. We have certain arbitration in mining matters here, which have been going on for last 8 to 10 years, probably 15 years. The second arbitral thing, because the earlier arbitrators died. So now the new arbitrators have come, and that is going on for last 8 to 10 years. Then there is cost-effective mechanism, the fees of the arbitrator. These are all things, but we need to have an approach by which we have a time-bound disposal of arbitral proceedings. The 2019 Act makes a reference where within a period of 12 months, the arbitral tribunal is required to give. For example, some of the glitches which were there in the 2015 amendment In 2019 amendment, like 29A, then addition of subsection 4 of section 23, certain other matters, they have been sought to be taken care of under 2019 amendment, but it's not a foolproof thing. There are so many other things which are also required to be dealt with. There is just one more matter that I would like to highlight, and that is essentially, suppose now, for example, the court has invoked the doctrine of the group of companies, and a non-signatory to the arbitration agreement is forced to go for arbitration. A non-signatory to the arbitration agreement would presuppose that he is a non-signatory to the main agreement also. 2, when you invoke such a doctrine, what happens? Are you bound by all the clauses in the contract despite being a non-signatory to the agreement? What are the safeguards available to you for being a non-signatory, and in what context are you being forced to come to that arbitration? I am not dealing with in greater detail, but I am only raising a red flag that group of companies doctrine, yes, in a given case, it may be a good thing, but it can't have a general application as such, because you're joining a non-signatory to the arbitration as a party to the arbitration. And is he bound by all the terms of the agreement which have been there, to which he is not a party, just because a group of company, a company to which he belongs, is a party? So that is another issue that, of course, requires a greater this one. The last issue that I would like to deal with is, there are certain contracts, and all of us must have seen them. Oil and Natural Gas Commission, ONGC contracts, the Gas Authority of India Limited, these contracts, I'm just mentioning a few illustrative contracts. These contracts have well inbuilt provisions wherein, suppose if a contractor is working at site and it's a site disposal contract, not an item rate contract, then in that case, in matters such as time, for extension of time, for overworking, if the items are more, it's a different thing, but overworking, etc., there are certain conditions. For example, Gas Authority of India Limited contract says, or ONGC contract said, that only if the extension is beyond a particular time, then you will be paid. If it is not beyond a particular time, then you will not be paid. Now, this is a term of the contract. An arbitrator is a creature of the contract. The arbitral tribunal is a creature of the contract. It is required to follow these principles. There is not one, but 10 Delhi High Court judgments and 5 Supreme Court judgments which have said the arbitrator, being the creature of the contract, is required to strictly go by the terms of the contract. Yet there is one judgment, and which came to be upheld by the Supreme Court. It's a very nice judgment delivered by Justice Mukul Mudgal, as his lordship then was in the Delhi High Court, invoking the principle of reasonability in the contract. Mind you, there are several good authorities, including Proskin and all those, which say that concept of reasonability cannot be invoked in arbitration proceedings while dealing with contract. He invoked the principle of reasonableness under the contract and said, no, that is true that you may have these terms while it is like this, but even if a party has worked for this, the principle of reasonability and reasonableness demands us to grant him something, and he granted something. That judgment, the SLP against that came to be dismissed. Of course, that part of the law is not final. There are subsequent later judgments, but this has created a bit of a confusion, because in the ongoing arbitration matters, these are issues which are very hotly contested. Friends, that said and done, I would not like to take much time, because initially around 8 to 10 minutes were allotted, and the earlier speakers have dealt with it in extenso. So thank you so much for inviting us. And of course, I leave the floor open to Shashank and Divyakant to decide the further thing.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful opening remarks. We have received a question for Honorable Justice Patel. Sir, there have been amendments in Section 11 of the Arbitration Act by way of Arbitration and Conciliation Amendment Act of 2019. So what is your opinion, the effect of omission of Section 11(6)(a) in Section 11?
I have actually held that, well, the Supreme Court judgments, in fact, Justice Nariman's judgment makes it very clear that the omission makes no difference and the position remains unchanged. That the court under 11, Supreme Court, when it's dealing with foreign arbitrations, and in the high courts when they're dealing with domestic arbitrations, are only looking at the existence of the contract, not on the merits of the contract. Now, this position is the position stated by the Supreme Court, and I don't think it's possible to find the slightest fault with this, because otherwise you're having a hearing before the arbitration as to whether you should have an arbitration. I mean, on the merits of the case, that defeats the entire purpose. That defeats the entire purpose. I don't think that the deletion has any impact at all on that. Interpretation is not only, in my view, correct, though I'm not anyone to say it could be incorrect, but it's the way forward. And in fact, that's the comment that the Supreme Court makes, that this is the way forward.
Right. Sir, if I'm not mistaken, you are referring to Mayawati Trading Private
Yes,
Limited.
yes, exactly.
Judgment of
it says so in fact, the words are, it would make no difference.
Right. That has been also quoted in your judgment. I just saw over the internet and on SCC online.
It was argued before. It was argued before.
Yes.
Wait, that's part of my job. No, I have to refer to Supreme Court.
Thank you.
We have a question for Justice Gavai. Sir, the limitation period for challenging an arbitral award is 3 months plus 30 days. Would this limitation ideally begin to run from the date of majority award, or would it run from the date of receipt of the minority award? So to say, in case there is a dissenting award and that comes at a later date, would the limitation run after all the 3 arbitrators have given their award, or should it run once the majority award has been received? What is your view on it, sir?
Ashtang, I think the answer could be found in subsection 2 of section 31 itself. If you read section 31, subsection 1, arbitral award shall be made in writing and shall be signed by the members of the arbitral tribunal. Then subsection 2, for the purpose of subsection 1, in arbitral proceedings with more than one arbitrator, the signature of the majority of all the members of the arbitrators tribunal shall be sufficient so long as the reasons for any omitted signature is stated. So suppose there are 3 arbitrators and 2 of them have passed an award, and the third one for A reason or B reason does not give his minority opinion. Should it mean that it should frustrate all the arbitral proceedings? So in my view, once an award is signed by a majority and they give reasons for non-signing of the award by the arbitrator who is not signed, the limitation would start from the date on which the majority award is issued by the party.
So the only challenge, I think, is in cases where there is a dissent award which comes on a later date, and the parties who are obviously challenging the majority award would like to take some sort of assistance from that minority award.
Shashank, I don't understand how the question arises. Justice Gavai has covered it fully. The minority award is in favor of the party who the petitioner in the 34. He's challenging the majority. He's not challenging the minority. The minority is in his favor. How can he leverage the delay in that to his advantage?
So that is an only opinion given by a minority.
By a minority.
That's not an award.
That's not an award. That's not an award to begin with. Oh.
So another question has come for Honorable Justice Patel. Sir, it again pertains to Section 11 and amendments there too. So the question is whether the amendments in Section 11.4, 11.5 and 11.6 will just add more steps to the appointment of arbitrators, or will these amendments actually help in speedy, effective and timely disposal of arbitration applications for appointment?
It's very difficult to answer that just now, because those are I take it that this is a question about the provisions introduced for institutional
Correct,
arbitrations.
sir.
Going through as I said, one area is, let's not forget that arbitrations are not only delayed in making of the award. Arbitrations are not delayed only in the appointment of the arbitration. Arbitrations are often delayed in an in-between process where the arbitrator starts, then either resigns his commission, demits office, or for some reason there is a challenge. This back and forth goes on. If institutional arbitrations can get rid of this delay, it's a good thing. Now, whether it will result in an initial delay or not, and how significant that delay will be, is difficult to say at this stage.
So because there has also been amendment in subsection 13, which says that the arbitrator has to be appointed by such institutions within 30 days from the date of reference to those institutions by either by the High Court or by the Supreme Court.
I don't know why that would necessarily entail a delay on its own.
Right.
So this is a question for Mr. Nadkarni. Sir, you had covered the aspect of Perkins' judgment as well as party autonomy, and you had given illustrations from the clauses of GAIL, BHA, NGC, etc. So Perkins actually not only deals with the clauses of unilateral appointment by the PSUs, but also by a lot of other usual suspects like NBFCs and real estate developers who were running a nexus, some of them, not all, running a nexus through arbitrators who were on their rolls, advocates who were giving template awards after awards. So I think Perkins, by following the principles laid down in TRF, has now made it almost impossible for a unilateral appointment of a sole arbitrator to take place. But I think the question is that subsequently there was a judgment of Justice Bhanumati which has slightly modified the position in certification, wherein she says that if there is a panel being maintained by one of the parties who's appointing the sole arbitrator, and that panel has been shared with the opposite side, and that from that panel the opposite side has to choose one, then the aspect of party autonomy is restored, and there is no element of impartiality.
Talking about railway electrification.
That's right.
That's right.
But then see paragraph 38 of that. That makes a clear-cut distinction between Perkins and TRF.
So
Yes.
Because of the actions that actually took place in that case. Mr. Nadkarni, you appeared, I think.
Yes, I have appeared.
So, sir, presently, do you think with Perkins and the subsequent judgment of central electrification, there is any possibility of unilateral appointment of the sole arbitrator by a party?
I think it's...
Sorry, sir.
No, you go ahead.
No, you please start. Then
No, you appeared. You're responsible.
That's okay. You first give your this one, please.
No, I don't think that the principle that has been set out in TRF and Perkins, anybody has any quarrel with it at all, or anybody has said that it is a wrong principle, that you can't have what is effectively from administrative law a departmental bias. This is what it is amounting to. This is the equivalent in arbitration law of that principle in administrative law. There's really no distinction.
So Divekant, what has been held in TRF is that a managing director will have a direct interest in the result between a lease between him and the other side. And therefore, the principle of bias to which Gautam has referred, the bias need not be personal, pecuniary. It could also be an official, and it should not be a real bias. The test is likelihood of bias.
Apprehension. And this is basically on the principle that, as Sushant just said some time back, the justice should not only be done, but seem to have been done. And therefore, I think the principle which is laid down in TRF is followed in Perkins, and TRF is also a judgment by three honorable judges, which is followed by 2 judges in Perkins.
Sir, another question for Mr. Nadkarni. Sir, you have already covered substantially the issue of Perkins, and it has led both arbitrators and the arbitration practitioners in a catch-22 situation. Now, the question which we have received is whether Supreme Court ought to have made the application of this judgment prospective and not retrospective, to avoid disqualification of arbitrators in pending arbitration. So, sir, what are your views on this particular issue?
So just to add what Divekant has said, the Delhi High Court has held that it is retrospective, and therefore that controversy has taken place.
Obviously, because Shashank, it lays down the law as on that date. It interprets the law, and while interpreting the law, they've held it. And it is in that connection, in the railway matter, I distinguished it, saying this is not a case where one arbitrator is foisted on a party, where there is no power to negotiate. But this is a case where there is an equal bargaining power. For example, there was a panel of arbitrators. Those were all independent. They were not on the payroll of the railways, etc. So it can apply to a standard form contract, which the builders and all have, where you choose a person and you choose a forum and drive the parties to that particular forum. So Perkins' principle as such is good, but it can't be universally applied anywhere and everywhere. For example, there are certain standard contracts of railways or even ONGC, etc., where you require a person who knows something about maritime law, something about engineering, something about infrastructure, etc. So it's not that everywhere you can have only judicial officers. You need otherwise a panel which has all, mix of all.
So there is a question for Justice Patel. Sir, again, coming back to the very important concept of disclosure, which you covered during your address. This is a question from Mr. Omar Ahmed from Cyril Amarchand. He's saying that if in a disclosure, the arbitrator discloses that he has written some articles, or even if he has not disclosed so, but there are some articles and opinions by that arbitrator published somewhere on the issue that he is likely to deal in the arbitration, would it be a ground for challenge?
In that form, it's difficult to say. If he is, for example, the article is a review of the state of the law, then there's no problem with it. If he is saying that such and such a thing is illegal or can never be countenanced, then he's taken a position. It depends on what that article says, what precisely. It is the same thing that would apply to, frankly, I don't think it's a different standard. Same thing that would apply to a judge must apply to an arbitrator, pretty much.
So just a follow-up on that. There are no consequences of giving an incomplete disclosure in the act, sir. Or even if the disclosure somewhat is found faulty or incorrect, there are absolutely no consequences that we have either seen through judicial pronouncements or in the act. So the arbitrators feel free to...
He doesn't get the rest of his fees. He doesn't get his fees. That's an enormous consequence.
So
What more do you want?
Since it is confidential, the others do not really get to know that any default by the arbitrators. So should it not really be considered by the legislature or by the courts that in cases where the disclosure has been found faulty or incorrect, there should be some consequence and there should be some, at least the judgments must mention the name of the arbitrator so that others can take account.
What, name them and shame them? I'm not sure. That's a great way to go. I don't know if your colleagues will agree with you. So.
No, that's not my question, sir.
So, whatever. Any practitioners.
So the next question is for Honorable Justice Patel, sir. So whether the stamp duty is also payable in the state where the arbitration is to be conducted, in addition to the stamp duty which is already paid in the state where the cause of action has arisen?
No, this question arose in December. And the Maharashtra Stamp Act says where the agreement is brought into court for any purpose. The arbitration, it was argued on the basis of various judgments, and I don't remember the name of the case, that the arbitration is that purpose. It will have to receive stamp because you may have got everything done in Vizag, but if your jurisdictional seat and venue is Mumbai, arbitration is being brought here, the local stamp will be paid and you will get the rebate for the stamp that you've paid outside. That's the correct way to read Section 3 of that Act. But it depends on what your local Act says.
I think I had taken a similar view when I was sitting at Mumbai.
I followed that, sir. I followed that. I cited that and I followed that. But this was different because the whole contract was performed outside. The only thing that was being done here was arbitration.
So there's a question for Justice Gavai on the group of companies doctrine that you had covered, sir. So what are the safeguards that are available to a non-signatory against invocation of a group of companies' doctrine, especially when it is not consenting to join the arbitration, which is different from an entity who's, in spite of being a non-signatory, still consenting to be participating in the arbitration?
So in both the fluoro controls, which is the judgment of 3 honorable judges, as well as Amit Lalchand Shah, it has been said that it has to be done in a very exceptional circumstances. It cannot be done as a routine. And for that, the court will have to go through the entire transaction and to find out what was the intention between the contracting parties. What was the intention has to be gathered from the set of the facts that appear for consideration before the court. And if upon consideration of the factual position, the court finds that there are compelling circumstances on the ground of composite reference, then composite performance of an agreement, and as added by the Supreme Court in case of Amit Shah, the sense of bringing efficacy in commercial transactions. The intention of the parties was also to bind a party, which is a company in a group of companies. Then in such exceptional circumstances, the court can, by invoking that doctrine, implead a party who is not a signatory to arbitration agreement. But such a thing has not to be done in a routine manner. And therefore, I think that while employing that doctrine, the courts will always have to be very cautious and not implead any party for merely an asking. I think both those judgments itself provide for sufficient care to be taken by the courts while invoking that doctrine. I think if Gautam wants to add anything on that.
No, that's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
So we have received another question for Mr. Nadkarni. So whether the amendment of time period for making an arbitral award, which is given in the section 29A of the Arbitration Act, whether such amendments are retrospective or prospective in nature, keeping in mind that there have been conflicting judgments by Delhi High Court. One says that it would be retrospective because it's a procedural change. Another says that it is not retrospective, and because the language of the amendment says it has to be prospective. So what's your views on it?
See, basically, Delhi High Court seems to be right that it's a procedural amendment, and procedural laws are only meant to subserve the process of justice, not to govern the whole process of justice. Now, for example, if you apply it with retrospective effect, even the awards which have been delivered, etc., or pending under 34
Correct.
can be set aside only on that ground. You don't need anything. I mean, those learned arbitrators did not even know that this time limit was there. Maybe they have taken indefinitely longer. Therefore, it has to be, I think Delhi High Court by and large is right on that it's a prospective.
There's a question for Justice Patel. So does the lack of a provision challenging the order passed by the arbitrator under section 16 before the court render the entire proceedings futile, as the party against whom such an application is dismissed will surely challenge an award under 34, assuming that the award is passed against that party?
No, in fact, I think it's the other way around. If you allow any number of innumerable interim sort of intervening appeals with the attendant delays in court, which is the first, as Mr. Nadkarni said, that's the reason that we have arbitration, because there is a backlog. Now, you don't want to add to that backlog by going up to a court from every single thing that the arbitral forum does. I think the idea is finish your job in the arbitral forum, then we'll have a look at it. Right, wrong, indifferent, finish it first.
Right, sir. So another question for Mr. Nadkarni. So there has been an amendment in section 42A,
Right.
which introduces confidentiality of information.
Right.
The question is, would it be correct to say that the newly inserted section 42A, which talks about confidentiality, has taken away the party's autonomy to choose if the proceeding should be confidential or not, as it uses the word shall?
See, introduction of section 42A is a welcome step. If you remember, Justice Sri Krishna Committee, pursuant to which that amendment has been brought about, had strongly recommended it, for the purpose of strengthening the Arbitration Act, including providing about confidentiality. That's what I referred. But by and large, the way it has been introduced, though it's a welcome step, the language of Section 42A, if you go through, is likely to raise issues which, and knowing the ingenuities of my profession, I'm saying of my tribe community, namely lawyers, we are likely to raise certain issues which would require judicial interpretation, and it will be taken as a substantial question of law going right up to the Supreme Court.
I say, Sushant, that is not allowed. You can't hedge your position like this. Huh?
That's a self-effacing comment.
No. You have to take a position and then estoppel will be applied against you.
So there is a question for Justice Patel and also for Justice Gawai. Both of you have dealt with Section 11 jurisdiction at some point of time. Sir, what we are seeing in practice is every high court has a different time frame for deciding Section 11. Bombay and Delhi are obviously quite swift, but many other high courts take a much longer time, and some high courts only hold Section 11 hearings on Fridays after the first half of the day. So, as a matter of suggestion for consideration and comment by both of you, sir, once the arbiter is appointed, he should only be confirmed after the disclosure is filed before the court. Because many times what is happening is that the court appoints an arbitrator in Section 11, and at the time of disclosure, the arbitrator will say that I am conflicted or I am in some other difficulty. Or even otherwise, the arbitrator will say that I have nothing to disclose. I have almost 70, 80 ongoing arbitrations, but I have sufficient time to devote. Now, as a party, you can't really object to that. He says he has 80 arbitrations ongoing, but sufficient time to devote. But if it comes back to the court to confirm, then there can be a lot of time saving, because otherwise the party will have to file a fresh Section 11 to contest such a disclosure, or in cases where the arbitrator has disclosed some conflict, the party will have to come again in a Section 11. And as I gave examples of other high courts where it can take somewhat 12 to 18 months for an 11 to get disposed of, that can be very time consuming. So as a method, can it not be used by the courts where the appointment is only indicative and only confirmed post the disclosure has been seen by the court itself? For Justice Patel and Justice Gawai's comments.
Justice Gawai, I will defer to on this.
Hey, Justice Sri Shashank, normally the practice that we followed in the High Court, and also in the Supreme Court, is that first we issue the notice. And after the notice is issued, if there is no contest, well and good. If there is a contest, then when we come to the conclusion that the dispute needs to be referred to an arbitration, normally the parties are asked to agree on a name of an arbitrator. And they are also requested to take consent of that arbitrator. So only after they speak, both the parties agree on a particular name, and the learned arbitrator who is proposed by them accepts the proposal to accept an arbitrator, then his name is finally approved and an order under Section 11 is passed either in the Supreme Court or in the High Court. I don't know about the practice which is followed in the other High Courts, but that was the practice which I had followed when I was sitting at Nagpur, when I was sitting at Mumbai, and also when I was a part of a bench of the learned Chief Justice, which was dealing Section 11 applications. Yes, Gautam, I think you can.
I agree. And, there are two things here. One, it depends on how each judge who has that assignment decides to list the Section 11.
That we have to leave it to his wisdom.
That you have to leave to the judge. That you can't dictate to anybody. Nobody can dictate to any judge. But the other thing that I've learned also from the elders, seniors, and including Justice Gawai, is that, each case is unique. Each case is different. No case is big or no case is small. Every case is as important as the next one. In many cases, there is an unfolding tragedy that is happening, which you have to pay attention to. On one side, you have a finance company. On the other side, you have an entity who has gone completely bankrupt because of market forces. He cannot afford an arbitration. If you are saying that you should mechanically appoint arbitrator, force it down his throat, these are considerations that a judge will look at in a humane manner. What do I do in a situation like this? We will try and resolve it there and then if we can. It's not that automatic. This will cause a delay in kickstarting the arbitration process. But that arbitration process itself may never take off because he can't afford it. And incidentally, on that, I noticed there's a question, and I'd like to know what Justice Gavai also has view on this, on whether we'll ever see third-party funding for arbitrations in India. So I'm really curious. It's common now elsewhere. So what do Sushant and Justice Gavai feel about this?
I can't offer any comment.
Maybe in that 20 lakh crore package, something can be worked.
Sushant is free to speak.
Okay,
no comments from either of us on that.
So there are two questions for Justice Patel, and these two questions pertain to the first principles. Now, it says that Section 13(3) provides for the power of the arbitral tribunal to decide on the challenge to appointment of an arbitrator if he doesn't withdraw from the office upon filing of such application. Isn't this violation of principles of natural justice and the Latin maxim nemo juris in causa sua? And in connection with that, does the arbitrator himself be allowed to decide?
No, I'm asking you, I answer that very simply. Are you saying that if an application is made before me or Justice Gavai that we should recuse, that we can't decide that recusal application? What is the 13th thing? It's a recusal application.
Right, sir.
So it's as simple as that. It's not more complicated than that. We should not be elevated to something that somebody else should decide whether I'm qualified. That's provided under 14. Ultimately, it might go there.
Right.
And in Sara's case, the Supreme Court has already held. It is not for the litigant to decide as to whether a judge.
It's not for the litigant to shop like this.
Right.
Because I recollect I had read in newspapers that the matter was listed before your Chief Justice was in Calcutta High Court.
Yes.
That one of the lawyers, he requested for recusal. And when the Chief Justice refused, he said that I am cursing that
exactly.
You will suffer from COVID and all that. He passed a very strong judgment.
Yeah. He cursed him in open court, banged the table, banged the mic, did all this.
And I think he was an associate of one of the famous lawyers at Mumbai.
Very likely.
I'll ask a final question for the panelists, and either one of you can take it, sir. This is with respect to sorry, what is the question? Sorry, I think that window has gone off. So there is a question on the aspect of Schedule 4, sir, that it is not mandatory. It is only directory. And some high courts, including Bombay High Court, has framed rules. Some other high courts also, I think, have framed rules. But many arbitrators, in spite of this being directory, do not wish to comply with it. And so the only remedy is that the high courts, while deciding Section 11, or the Supreme Court, while deciding Section 11, can recommend that Schedule 4 should be applied. So do you think it should be made mandatory in times to come, or there should be some other way out so that the parties can budget their arbitrations in future?
This is going.
I would better request Sushant to answer that question.
What about Justice Patel? What are his views?
As long as you're going to have individual arbitrations, it's going to be very difficult to impose a schedule like this. Institutional arbitrations have a schedule of fees. It's the difference between going to an individual surgeon and going to a hospital. That's really going to be the distinction. Please don't forget that even our schedule of fees has some things that are missing in it. There's a lot of work that, for example, happens up to Section 17, and then the matter gets settled. There is no provision made in our schedule of fees for some reasonable recompense to the arbitrator for the work done up to the 17. Now, the interim applications are of various types. They go through various stages: discovery, inspection. Now, all of this needs some tweaking, but ultimately, if it's a matter of agreement, it must be left to the parties to agree before the arbitrator what the fees are. And the arbitrator can't be forced into saying you must work at these rates. If he's not agreeable, he's not agreeable. What can be done?
Shashank,
He's also a free agent.
yeah. Section 1114 itself says that it's only a model.
That's right. It's a free agent.
Model can't be, there are certain lawyers, what their charges are. Other lawyers are available.
Yes, certain lawyers. We know, Sushant.
I mean, that applies to arbitrators also, because some of the arbitrators are in great demand.
But the two people who are not free agents today are Justice Gavai and myself. Think about that.
Sir, I think we have now run out of time, although we have several other questions, which Divekant and I will be sharing a reference note shortly, which will be sent by CDR. I think some of those questions will be answered, which mainly discusses all the aspects that our panelists have discussed today, and also the citations of the case laws that people have been asking on the side windows. All of that will be provided. I would like to express my gratitude to all the three panelists, Honorable Justice Gavai, Honorable Justice Patel, Mr. Atmaram Nadkarni, Additional Solicitor General of India, for sparing time on a weekend. Thank you very much, sir, for addressing.
It's not a weekend for us today.
It's a long
It was a good working day.
Thank you for addressing the participants on such a vast topic and taking up some really, really controversial questions. I'm hopeful that these answers will go a long way, but will also invoke a lot of further debate on some of these issues. Thank you, CODR, for giving us all the technical support, and Bar and Bench for doing the media publication for this event. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shashank. Thank you, Divekant, and thank you, Vikas. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.